Good morning, dear viewer. If you are in Europe, good afternoon. If like me, you're in UK, good morning. If you're in Europe, good afternoon, like me. And if you're in America, well, very good morning to you. I'm joined today by, and I've looked down to make sure I get this right, Mark Watson, who is, now it's ANSP or ATNS these days, Mark. Where do you work within NATS?
The NSP, NATS. I work in the drones team, and my job title is Head of UTM Service Integration, which, as the word suggests, is about how we integrate UTM services as part of our manned operation, as people would normally know us by in the future.
And you're coming on to talk about your work with GUTMA. Now, GUTMA is the Global UTM Association, and it's an association that's based in Switzerland. And well, what good's it going to do to me or for me with my Phantom flying here in Africa?
That's a good question. The Global UTM Association was established a couple of years ago, and I was part of helping to establish it. And it sort of recognized at that point there was a absence in the market of a good association that brought the UTM organizations together to, firstly, to give them access to what was going on in the development of UTM, both in the manned aviation world as well as broader in the RPAS UAS world, but also to give them a voice as an association to be able to influence direction of those developments.
That's interesting.
It should be giving to you as a drone operator, as a UTM service provider as we go forward.
And it's interesting you said man then, because is that part of the thing? I'm going to jump around it. Is that part of the thinking? Is UTM not only about RPAS but also about exactly where the manned aviation fits into the picture?
That inherently has to be part of the picture. Certainly globally, people are coming around to the idea of ultimately it's going to be an integrated operation of both manned and unmanned aircraft. So as we develop towards that integrated nirvana, that it's going to really sort of allow the drone industry to flourish, then the manned aviation has to work into there, and the two, the emerging UAS market as well as the pre-existing manned aviation world have to work together and come together safely, obviously, but coexist.
So you work at NATS, which is the National Air Traffic Service in the UK, which, just to unpack it for people that don't understand it, is it one? Maybe you can help me understand it. I think it's a private company that's given the rights or the powers to run air traffic in the UK, something along those lines. You probably got a better version of it. No,
that's close enough. That's good enough.
Okay, so how do your colleagues, and funny enough, quite a few of my friends work in NATS these days. I used to be in the Air Force, playing the air traffic game many years ago when Pontius was a pilot, as they say, and quite a few of my chums are there now. But what's the NATS feeling? Is there love and joy towards RPAS, or are you in the suspicious office? Have they given you the smallest office with no windows?
I haven't even got an office. Very much a hot desk, mobile community at NATS. Not the controllers, I hasten to add, but office workers like myself. As it's there. The industry is there. It's growing, and we know it's growing. And as a navigation service provider, we need to be able to ensure the safety of the airspace as we go forward. That remains our number one reason for being, whether it's manned aviation with our current operation, or the growing integration and accommodation of UAS platforms. It remains, that safe operation. So that's at the heart of what we think about the industry.
And what's your role in GUTMA then? And why on earth are you there? Why do you go to meetings in Switzerland?
Well, most of our meetings are done virtually through the power of the internet. And the reason for my role in it, previously, I was the head of R&D at NATS up to last year. So my background personally has always been in innovation in the industry and moving it forward, looking at new developments and how we exploit them. And for me, I wanted to bring that access to the UTM market to NSPs like NATS, like the broader NSP base that I work in, so as we could grow together. So it wasn't seen as an industry of them and us, where maybe the manned aviation market would be dictating to this emerging UTM market, or indeed vice versa, the disruption that could be perceived as such an innovation like this would be disruptive to our existing operation. So that was my main motivation for being part of it.
Help me out with the NSPs. Are there protocols? We know there's sort of radio protocols and paperwork protocols. It's probably all computer protocols now for handing aircraft off from one country to another, say from the UK to France. Is there a software level underneath that these days then that's a common architecture throughout the world? So one message will always look the same at whoever's screen, wherever they are in the world.
For manned aviation, that's certainly the case, and of course that's been developed over 50 odd years now, going right back to the Chicago Convention of ICAO back in 1945. So it's all emerged as an industry from there, and UAVs, a classic sort of disruptive innovation that they represent. There's a lot of catching up to do. There's a lot of gaps. So whilst we're established as a manned aviation environment with all the protocols that go with that, so as we can work internationally and interoperably, that's where we need to get the drone industry up to a similar sort of level of interoperability.
So GUTMA is going to help the RPAS industry get to that level of common speaking, a common language with the grown-ups, if you will.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. One of the first aspirations we had in establishing GUTMA was to develop an aviation standard. Can take many years, or it does take many years. And of course, that's not going to suit this rapidly developing market. So the idea with GUTMA was that we could quickly establish the de facto standards that would help those UTM operators to flourish. So that's at the heart of what we do. We established a UTM architecture diagram to start with last year. We've established a flight protocol, exchange protocol, and a few other protocols just to help get the industry going, get an established way of interoperating together.
The flight logging, the protocols, and I think the logging protocols are a brilliant idea, not just from the point of view of UTM operators, but from the actual operator's point of view, so that every one of your platforms says the same thing to you, and your software for logging, for your maintenance and all the other day-to-day stuff that you need, UTM to on board with that standard yet.
Sorry, Gary, just lost the signal a little bit there.
Sorry, the logging, the flight logging standard, I think it's a great idea. Have many manufacturers come on board with that yet?
Yeah, certainly the key UTM service providers within GUTMA have all implemented that standard or variations of it, and ensured their platform would allow that level of interoperability. Because certainly, going back to, I mentioned we did a UTM architecture as one of the very first products out of GUTMA, and that was very important to show the breadth of the different organisations, and whether it be Met service providers or so on, the breadth of the organisations. So interoperability between them is absolutely key. What we're seeing now, I think, as an industry, is we all recognise we need it, but there's that first mover advantage that people going, okay, but if I make it interoperable with someone else, perhaps I lose my supremacy as a first mover, and the investment I might have made with my VCs or whoever else has funded them. So there's a bit of a tension there I see at the moment as an industry. We have the standards, and there is the interoperability there that absolutely we need to get to. But just getting over that initial barrier of the first mover advantage, I think.
Yes, but really what I suppose what I was asking was the actual manufacturer, say DJI, have they said, okay, yeah, we're going to make sure our aircraft transmits the data you need, and your logging data and stuff like that? Because that make it a lot easier, wouldn't it, if it all fell into your system in that format?
In fairness, no, we're not quite there yet. Whether it be DJI, SenseFly,
or whoever,
or
yeah,
the other man. Everyone's in that same space. They've all come up with their own ways of doing things. So it's getting people to recognise the need to converge on those standards. and recognizing that that is actually the best route to go for developing the value propositions for all the competitors in the market, not just the one or two at the moment.
I'm going to have a word with some open source friends of mine and try and get that into a couple of projects, and then you'd have thousands of aircraft suddenly coming that way. But it does make sense, and I can see it makes sense from a business point of view. As I say, forget the UTM. If all my aircraft spoke the same language and went into the logging system in the same way, it would just be much easier, much easier. So it's a really good idea. So that's the aircraft logging, and then you also have I wrote it down, the flight declaration protocol. So what's the difference between the two?
The flight declaration protocol is very much about a common, almost like we have in manned aviation world, the flight planning, the flight plan that's submitted of an aircraft before it flies for controlled flight, having that same format that can then be equally shared across service providers. Flight logging is very much about recording where the flight's going to, where it's been, and the information that can be exchanged through the drone operating system, the flight management system, and the underlying fleet management systems of the drone operators. So I guess that's more down at the operators level. I'd be more interested in the flight declaration protocol, perhaps, whether it be exchanging between UTM service provider to UTM service provider. If you're in an environment where there's multiple overlapping service providers, or indeed interfacing to an air traffic ANSP like ourselves.
At the end of the day, though, to a user like me, I should be able to select the one of my choice based on his app's orange and his one's blue, and I like the blue colored app. But at the end of the day, the aeronautical information and the logging into the system should be identical. It should almost be user choice, or is one operator, is the goal to have one operator even?
I think that's still very much the emerging market. It's very much like the mobile telephony market. You know, once we first all got our cell phones, there was competition between the breadth of the network and the value-added services that operators offered for us as users. As drone operators for commercial operations, I think we'll see that with the UTM service providers, whether it's Altitude Angel, AirMap, Unifly, and so on. You know, they're starting to integrate vertically through the other services that you might need for value-add services, whether it's detailed MET service providers and so on. So I think that would be the choice as a drone operator. There'll be some basics and prerequisites that if you need to work near controlled airspace, whether it's LANS interoperability in the FAA's US scenario, or indeed the equivalent in Europe or Far East. So there'll be some basics that you'll need if you want to operate near controlled airspace that I think all service providers provide. And then it would be the cost for the service that they charge you. So yeah. I think that's not established, that's not settled down yet. It's still emerging, the different value propositions and the different additional features that might be in there.
So it's great, really, that you're sort of impartial away from that VC funding frenzy, a feeding frenzy that is going on. I know exactly what you mean. And so it's good that you're to one side. How many other air traffic organizations from around the world are represented?
In Global UTM Association, there's I can't remember exactly off the top of my head now. There's 60 members overall in the association right now. Second year of operation. That's roughly split 50-50 between the larger organizations and small, medium enterprises. ANSPs specifically, there's about 3 or 4 ANSPs involved through that, 5 or 6, something of that order, which I guess proportionally is what you would expect of an association such as.
And have you got people like, I think Thales are one of the big radar makers, aren't they? Have you got people from places like that there? Because obviously they're going to be making the equipment that's got to speak to whatever the devices are. And I suppose also then things like ADSB and other electronic conspicuity. I would assume that the UTM would have to accept data in whatever the next format is.
Absolutely. There are some big traditional ATM service systems providers as members. Talos is a good case in point. They're a member. There's a whole list of members actually on the Global UTM GUTMA website at gutma.org that people can have a look at the breadth of membership there. But Hitachi is another one, not a traditional ATM service provider, but as you might recognize, quite a big company investing in it, NTT in Japan. So yeah, there's a good representation there, Indra from Spain, and so on.
And a lot of people are pinning their hopes on 5G being useful for unmanned aircraft. Are you able to talk to that from the GUTMA position or even from your NATS position?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from my own personal belief, I think the future of how we survey these aircraft, whether you know, in an urban environment where mobile telecoms type technology naturally lends itself to something more remote operations, where that's not going to be so appropriate, and then ADSB and the existing aviation surveillance methods come much more to the fore. So I think the reality of the future, there'd be some basic information that we'll need on position, perhaps on intent, perhaps on connectivity to the RPAS operator. And that will very much dictate then the geography, what technology we use. But you've got to look at what's out there today and what's going to really accelerate the industry. And for me personally, I think it needs to be perhaps ADSB for the more remote areas to get things going, whether that's for the fullness of time, that might evolve to something else, and 4G, 5G in the urban areas today. But you can do a lot with 3G as well. We've seen that from no end of trials. I think as an industry where we need to get to is, okay, what is the essential information that we really actually do need for the control and the traffic management over and above what the payloads might actually need for perhaps real-time video backloading and so on.
You won't have seen it, but I cheekily put a little video up that suggests, and a hashtag, that we should have no GA below 2K, and because we're going to help them with their safety, and they should also be equipped with ADSB. But if we get that general aviation up there, if they have an engine failure, they've got a lot longer to think about it. They're far more likely to be able to speak to a controller, and they'll be visible on radar both as a primary contact and as a ADSB. So I think we can do a favour there. Surely we'll reach a point where, say, up to 1,000 feet could be use space, and then 1,000, 2,000 feet buffer, and then let them get up, let the unmanned aircraft loose. I'm a little bit bemused as to why it's quite so granular at low level, because that is the hard bit to see, be it radio wise, radar wise, or whatever. And if manned aircraft were to all have ADSB, FLARM, or I know the UK has done some fantastic work, and I'm ranting at you, preaching to the converter, because you guys are really ahead of the game with all of this. So just let me rant at you for a moment. But yeah, I don't see why manned aircraft isn't coming to the play fast, the pitch faster with ADSB, because we can get out of the way with the very simplest of a flight controller with just a receiver. The unmanned aircraft can get out of the way, and the manned aircraft need never know it was there.
As someone who's led for the UK some of the electronic conspicuity work for general aviation, I can see exactly the points you're making. I'll be interested to see how your article stimulated any responses from the general aviation community.
Well, wasn't all that positive. Wasn't all that positive. And I'm a pilot myself, but it's just, and really, there's been two instances where electronic conspicuity actually, because being invisible is great until you need to be found. I was involved in sadly at a place where there was a fatal glider accident, and they were only like a kilometre from us. We took another aircraft to find them, and another friend of mine had a very good friend of his go in, and he went in 500 meters from the end of a runway that he took off from, straight into a forest, and it took him a week to find them. So being invisible is great if your reason is you're flying in a dodgy manner and you don't want to be seen. But when you want to be found, you need to be found. Rant hat off. It's
throughout my time working with general aviation, certainly in the UK largely, I've seen great recognition and support for the right product at the right price point. They get the value to them for their own electronic conspicuity of air-to-air conflicts, and indeed they recognise the emergence of the drone industry and the need to be able to see each other. So, I believe the general aviation community get it. What if the aspiration is still about integrated airspace? What we need to find, and quite rapidly, as you quite correctly say, is an interoperable solution once again to allow drones and general aviation to coexist in the airspace. I don't really see segregation being the answer necessarily. I think as we evolve towards integration, there might be some specific, whether it's done in a dynamic manner rather than permanent static airways for drones and separated from general aviation. I don't see that being the right steps for the industry, but equally I don't see necessarily just technology being the answer. Everyone gets detected a void and it's all happy and there's no incidents. I don't think it'd be quite like that. I think there's a learning phase to go through with perhaps some form of accommodation and segregation in a very dynamic sense to allow some operations to start, and then for us as an industry to learn how best to move towards integration.
Yes, we've got one of our Australian viewers there. Hello, Oz by drone. If Jay was above 2K, they'd have no boogeyman reason to alarm the public about drones. Yeah, there you go. You see, there. It's the wrong choir here. No, it's look.
There's valid reasons. Sorry, Gary. There's lots of valid reasons why general aviation need to operate below 2,000 foot, whether it's low-level helicopter operations, military low-level flights. And indeed GA transited in and out of licensed and unlicensed airfields and so on. So there are good reasons for them to be operating below 2,000, as I'm sure you're.
But if they all had ADSB, then we could see them and get out of the way of them. For RPAS can get out of the way of ADSB traffic. You can do it now with RG-Pilot and RG-Plane, and all you need is a receiver, and then it makes a decision and gets out of the way. Aren't we going to be I suppose, but I've spoken to Richard Parker. Richard Parker puts up my rants very well. And there is a need for how much information a controller in particular needs to see, because he doesn't need to see all that information, and then obviously it'll just pop up as required and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, and you look at you mentioned Richard Parker at Altitude Angel. Of course, Altitude Angel is a strategic partner with NATS and done some great work together. The drone assist app has been really successful for us. But I use that as the example. It's similar with AirMap and Unifly and the other guys as well. We've put functionality in there where you can press a button and say fly now, so it starts creating that community-based conspicuity of where people are operating. And so there's very much general aviation taking that same approach of recognizing the community. It's better to broadcast your position for those sort of conspicuous reasons.
And at the end of the day, it's never been easier to just sit a Raspberry Pi with some sort of SDR receiver on it and pull that data from all over the country. When ADSB was rolled out and there's super expensive towers by big military contractors, they probably never thought for a second that community-based organizations would end up with a better multilateration network on single board computers than the multi-million pound systems. But that's the way of technology, isn't it? And that's why all of this has got to be a lot more agile. Not really meant to have a dig at air traffic, but it's got to be a lot more agile, because a year in the drone world's 2 generations. It's
absolutely. And there's a dilemma there between the advance and speed of that technology versus the reliability and certifiability of the sort of systems we use for in air traffic for obvious safety purposes. That's something we'd never compromise on, as you'd expect of us. So how do we embrace those new technologies? And the massive investments NSPs around the world have made in their technology base, getting the full value out of that life, because ultimately they're paid by the airline customer. So surveillance and ADSB is a great case in point. If you've just got an effective and very expensive, as you say, radar network, you can't quickly junk that and put ADSB in quickly, because there's an asset there that you've paid for. So, getting that balance of full asset utilization, I think is the phrase, with embracing the new technology and the standardization of those technologies to ensure safety is the crux, I think.
Well, we're down here. I'm in South Africa, and we've signed up to the space-based ADSB via Arion, and you guys at NATS have just signed a bit of paper with them as well. I'm guessing for the Atlantic stuff, most of the region in South Africa is water. It's probably like 80% of it, all the way down to the South Pole, most of the way across to Australia, and then across to South America. So there's an awful lot of places where ADSB just does, ground-based ADSB just doesn't reach. But I've noticed that the coverage, I'm watching it, the coverage of ground-based stuff is a little bit sketchy because, of course, the antenna's got to be pointing up, and everyone that's had ADSB fitted in South Africa so far has got it pointed in the normal way. But I'm wondering a little bit off topic there. But I'm guessing soon ADSB will be everywhere, and pretty good as well.
Yeah, and we've all seen it with its flight radar 24 and so on, the proliferation of publicly sourced surveillance information, ADSB information. So it's going to be around for a while, and to a certain extent for information-based services, it's great. But then for another extent, for safety-critical services, when you need something of much higher integrity, hence the need for a more expensive ADSB implementation. So those sort of public facilities only go so far.
And many in 2010, I was just asked by drones, has anyone written something from ARPA with SDR, generate proximity alarms? There's plenty of stuff like that out there. And if you use Mission Planner and if you have a receiver on board your aircraft, it will get out of the way. That's in must. It will get out of the way of the aircraft that it sees. Depends on, and what it will do is a range of how far away you want to get out of the way of it. So it's coming, and it's something that the drone industry can react to very, very quickly. And I was just going to mention that Shrivenham in 2008, 2010, something like that, their blades and 2XL, probably NATS was probably part of that trial as well. They aggressed a Seneca with their aerobatic aircraft and had a little magic box from Selex Galileo, however you say it, who that saw the traffic coming and saw it a long time before the man did on every occasion, and they actually had to dial that down because it was detecting birds lifting in from fields and causing alerts. So the technology's out there. Are we at the point where the manned world's got to catch up a little bit?
One of the interesting things with the US industry is, so we from the manned aviation, our safety cases are built on, 747s, A380s coming together and the safety of life for that sort of criticality. For drone operations, it's not that safety argument. It's a different safety argument, perhaps a much lower bar to have to cross. And I think we need to get to is a good articulation of what that safety argument, the acceptable safety case for drone operations is. And then, long way to answer the question, then we in the manned aviation world can look at that and see what we can really learn from that industry to see if there is value that we can assimilate as we go forward and evolve for very much unified traffic management, not just UAS traffic management.
No,
so I think the key point there, just to reiterate, is I think that drone industry and the technologies there need to mature, need to understand what the safety case is for they're predicated on before we could really see how we could take value from those developments.
Is the drone industry coming to the party enough with GUTMA and saying, hey, look, this is what we can do? Or is it only through GUTMA's board members' knowledge of the industry that the capabilities at the moment? I mean, we could be helping ourselves a little bit more by coming to the party, couldn't we, as an industry?
It's a tricky one. Seeing what the great work the FAA is doing, what Singapore's been doing, Japan and indeed Europe. There's lots of institutional level stimulation and of innovation for us to learn that, which is necessary. But also, I remember speaking to some of my UK CAA colleagues about beyond visual line of sight applications, and there's not a proliferation of them knocking down the door, it would seem, from that regulator's perspective, of with the use cases that they want to do. So whilst we can think of some great opportunities, whether it's agriculture and infrastructure inspection and so on, that we already know of, I think it's almost like everybody's standing back a little bit, not willing to take the first plunge to really get it going, and then opening the floodgates, so to speak.
Well, I wonder if the floodgates really will open, and I wonder if in a lot of ways if we're not overcomplicating something that could be, kind of a lot simpler, whether it's really needed. But it's good. You've got to have it in place, and it's got to be free and fair. That's my biggest worry. I did used to have a poster and say, "Know your enemy, GUTMA." My biggest worry is those venture capital backed. Some of them companies wanting to sew up stuff, and in some cases based on some really poor aviation data, which is almost might as well not have it. No data is better than bad data. So that there are high standards set for the aviation data displayed on apps, and I personally kind of would always like it to actually just come from the country of source, from that country's database, as it were, which might be a different mindset or might not be possible or whatever, and would probably never happen here. So it's key to have the correct information. So that's my worry. My other second worry is that people are rushing to sew up the lower airspace. The first 500 feet has suddenly become very valuable. It hasn't been valuable in the past, but it is now. So I'm happy that there's some oversight from people outside of the VC world there.
Well, I could give it a good example in the UK. NATS have been working with the UK Department for Transport, the CAA, to get geo information out there as part of our regulatory function to provide app manufacturers, let's say, the right information to put into their apps as an authoritative source. We feel the NASP is in a really good, strong position to provide that sort of interface and service to the drone industry. That's only going to help it, because you're absolutely right. It has to be authoritative and qualitative, credible data, really, that these operational decisions are based on.
And I think a lot of the problem, manufacturers and a lot of enthusiasts will hate me for saying what I'm about to say now, but the no-fly zones really should work, regardless of whatever craft you have. And the only way of making that fair is if it's real, genuine information, then you're not flying because of genuine reasons. And that would stop a lot of problems in a heartbeat. But of course, manufacturers aren't going to be happy because they're not going to be able to sell as many platforms into the city. So it is a chicken and egg sort of thing. Otherwise, I can't see how air traffic and NATS are going to ever chase down all the problems.
Well, anyway, we've got a lot of information that we can help as part of that solution to the problem of making that information available first and foremost, making sure operators have got the right information to stay safe. Of course, it's not going to stop those who want to break the rules, but those who do want to stay within the rules, we provide them with the right information to allow them to develop their business models. I think that's the right way of tackling this.
And where do you see the UK? Two questions, I suppose. Where do you see your role in GUTMA taking you? And where do you see in 10 years' time? What's your dream policy to be in place for the UK?
Interesting questions. As an association with GUTMA, certainly our focus in the short term is continue with representing the UTM industry, our members, to make sure we have a voice and make sure we can learn from the various great institutions that are going on, whether it's the standards bodies of RTCA and EUROCAI, the manned aviation world, or indeed the political institutions of European Commission, the FAA, and similar in the Far East and Middle East. Making sure there's an active dialogue between all parties. That's what it's about, really, rather than one group making rules based on assumptions. Always, to my mind, we want to avoid the situation where Kodak is now making the rules for the emerging digital camera market. Of course, innovation doesn't work that way. So how do we learn from innovation and bring those two parts of the industry together? I think that's the role of GUTMA in making sure it has the role of those innovative, the voice of those innovative members, and bringing it to help influence regulation and decision making of the incumbent industry, I think. The second part of your question, perhaps you could...
Well, it was really, well, how would you see in 10 years' time, how would you see the use space, if you will, the unmanned aircraft working in the UK, in the dream world,
Well, the dream world, certainly use space within Europe. You look at the timescales, very ambitious, of early 2020s, having an integrated service with 4 stages of U1 to U4, well published from Single European Skies, ATM Research, CESAR, JU, and the European Commission, and what they aspire to. So I think we'll be some way along that way, and it'll be very much, I think, certainly in 10 years, you'd imagine that the business cases for beyond visual line of sight will have really driven that. So we're all sat here looking forward, thinking what the future might be. But if those agricultural cases don't really come forward and you can do it with just visual line of sight, then perhaps there's not the need for BV loss, or same for infrastructure. People will innovate ways around the problems that they perceive, whilst in some cases, there will be really good, strong use cases for long-range BV loss, things that will have established themselves, really.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. We are on the cusp of the BV loss revolution. All the platforms, I can buy a Chinese. When I started SUS News 10 years ago, DoD people told us there'd be no such thing as a sub $10,000 autopilot, and a sub this and a sub that, and it's all come true. And now for sub $1,000, I can create a platform that will map 1,000 hectares, which would 10 years ago people would have just laughed at you. So things will change in a big way. And just being mentioned Osby Jones saying unlocking no-fly zones for DJI in Australia, send an email, then plug and pray. Yeah, absolutely, it is a problem. And so I would hope that GUTMA will be working with manufacturers to create a system that is app-based, that you're there, you've got the genuine information, and it is the air traffic service provider of the country which you're in who's in effect giving you that permission, not the manufacturer, but the actual. I don't think manufacturers should be involved in any, but I don't see how they can unlock a no-fly zone. To my mind, and I know I've been controversial in our world, to my mind, it's only the air traffic agency in that country that you're operating that can do that.
But then, in fairness, as a stepping stone towards getting to that point where it's the appropriate authority, see the great work DJI have done, for example, and others have done in helping move us to understand what those requirements really need to be by the work they've done in their own systems. That's really what we need, examples of that to help us stimulate it, rather than sitting in a room and trying to do it from first principles. Actually, some good test cases and trials that help give us those answers and help validate them, I think.
And so the apps,
it's a way street, isn't it? See what you're saying? Absolutely, it's not the end solution necessarily, but it's a good way along the road to find out what the end solution really should be.
Well, I suppose the apps that are allowing the LANC or Lance, I call it LANC. They apparently pronounce it Lance. But those apps are really enable. They are kind of very much on the stepping stone to that sort of a thing, because that's the airspace you're getting in the go for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So do you think we'll see something like that in the UK? Does the UK and Europe share a Lance vision for built up areas?
I think they do. The UK is certainly in alignment with the European Commission and the stuff that's coming out of U-Space. This design, we're very much part of that. Brexit, no, we're still part of that. It's still part of the future for us. We've been a long-term contributor to that. So that's what we see as the roadmap towards development in UK airspace.
I've been waffling to you for 43 minutes. You're a busy man. I'm taking your time. What value does GUTMA bring to? Does NATS bring? What do you and NATS bring to GUTMA?
I think as an ANSP, I've been really privileged to be a part of some of the developments that NATS have done. For example, I've already mentioned Altitude Angel and the work we've done with the Drone Assist app, the Drone Safe website we created with the UK CAA and Department for Transport. How we've cooperated and collaborated, we think quite innovatively, and try to put ourselves at the forefront at how to engage the drone community as it starts to emerge and establish. So I think bringing that sort of innovative, forward-thinking sort of aspect of an ANSP into the Global UTM Association and the members, to give them that access to that sort of manned aviation thinking, and indeed to learn from them to what we can reflect back into the channels that I might have access to, with whether it be the regulatory or otherwise our normal operation. I think that's what we get out of it.
And I think you've actually got Altitude Angels actually in some ops rooms in the UK now.
Yes, we've used their software in something in the UK called non-standard flight planning. For those flights that are not commercial air transport that might want to do something different, like crossing Class D airspace, we used to have a manual system, not least because there was so few requests that a manual system was absolutely fine. But we've taken the opportunity to use their software as a first step towards a UTM, a unified traffic management system, as we refer to it in the UK now, picking up the manned and the unmanned together as the first piece of software to start using in that stepwise evolution, I think, in our operation.
I'm going to have to start using that unified. I'm going to have to start remembering that. And also, I know that they talk about it's also integrating, which wouldn't be your part, but vehicles and stuff like that. There's going to be all sorts of remotely operated things that need to have traffic lights. It's an exciting time, and I'm very glad to hear that NATS is ahead of the curve as ever, and putting the hard yards in and thinking where we might be. So thanks very much for doing that, Mark. And I better let you go, because otherwise I've had you all day. I'm sure we've got a couple of questions in the comments. I'm sure we'll get more moving along. So if we may, I'd love to speak to you again further down the road, and maybe see you at Farnborough if you're going to be at Farnborough this year.
Indeed, and plugging the Global UTM Association, the GUTMA annual conference. That's the 5th and 6th of June in Madrid. I'd welcome all your listeners to that. It's not just for GUTMA members, it's also open to non-members as well. A really good forum for us to meet and take these sort of conversations on further.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much for your time. So I look forward to hearing more in the future. I'll put a link to GUTMA down the bottom. Dear viewers, thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to join us at 2100 GMT tonight for our normal Drone and Sundry hangout, when we'll be talking springing drones, amongst other things. Mark, thanks very much. I look forward to seeing you again. Everyone, take care. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.
Very welcome. Bye-bye.